If the low end of your track isn't hitting, don't reach for an EQ, at least not yet. If your kick, your 808, your bass is not hitting, especially when they're combined, chances are you're experiencing a different problem that EQ simply won't solve. And that problem is phase cancellation. What is phase cancellation? Phase refers to the relationship and timing between two or more sound waves. When multiple audio signals are combined, they can either reinforce each other, meaning they're in phase, or cancel each other out, being out of phase. This entirely depends on the alignment of the waveforms. Phase cancellation happens when two or more of these waveforms are out of alignment with each other and ultimately cancel each other out, which means that they're going to be less audible and less clear in your mix. Even crazier, if two sounds are perfectly out of phase with one another, they'll entirely cancel each other out and you'll hear absolutely nothing. For example's sake, I got two tracks here. Both are an 808 and it's the exact same audio, but what I've done is I've reversed the phase on one of these 808s. You can see that they're moving in different directions. When the one on the bottom is going up, the one on the top is going down. These are perfectly out of phase with one another, and because they're the exact same signal, just with the polarity reversed, they're ultimately going to cancel each other out. So right now, as an example, when I play this and I leave the top one muted, you're going to hear the 808 clearly, but the second that I unmute the top one, the out of phase one, you're going to hear that these two sounds cancel each other out and ultimately sound like nothing is happening at all, almost as if the bass or 808 was muted altogether. As you can hear, when the 808 was playing on its own, you could hear it clearly, and the second that I brought in the other duplicate, the 808 that was out of phase, playing at the exact same time, they completely canceled each other out, and the 808 vanished as a result. And this is an extreme and particular example, but you can imagine that the more sounds you have in a set frequency range, the greater the likelihood that you will experience some sort of phase cancellation and potentially other phase-related issues. And the reason why phase issues are more pronounced in the low end of a mix is because low-frequency sounds have longer wavelengths compared to mid and high frequencies. When it comes to mid and high frequencies, human hearing is less sensitive to phase discrepancies in these areas due to their shorter, quicker waveforms. Phase differences become more significant for longer wavelengths, as even slight phase misalignments in the low end can cause noticeable interference patterns, including cancellation. While phase issues could certainly exist in the mid and high frequencies, they're ultimately harder to hear. Because of this, we often can't perceive phase interference patterns with mid and high frequencies as easily as we can with low frequencies. Now, you might be wondering, how exactly can you tell if phase cancellation is happening in your mix? For our purposes focusing on the low end, you might notice that your bass and kick sound thin or hollow or just weak. It's not as impactful, especially if you solo each of those sounds and they're hitting nice, but the second you put them together, all of a sudden there's like this missing area in the low end. Chances are that is indicative of a phase issue that's taking place between those sounds and possibly other sounds in your mix as well. So to show you what phase issues sound like in the context of a typical mix, here's a track I've got open, and I'm not gonna lie, there's actually quite a few bass sounds in here. There's 6 different bass sounds, being an 808, a synth bass, an electric bass, another synth bass, and even a kick drum. So obviously there's a lot of different low-end sound sources, and while a lot of the time they do cooperate, you're going to hear when I play this mix and I show it to you without the phase fixed, you're going to hear that there's going to be a dip in the lows and the low mids. But the second that I fix the phase, you're going to hear that that bass really comes up. That low end especially becomes way more pronounced and way more impactful in the mix. Check this out. So hopefully you could hear the difference there in terms of the frequency presence of the bass. It was definitely a lot less clear, less articulate, more muddy before I fixed the phase issues, and after I did that, you could hear a significant bump in the low end and the presence of the bass itself. Phase issues can also sound a bit different. Sometimes they could sound like muddiness or a lack of clarity between sounds, a loss of stereo imaging resulting in a collapsed or smeared sound, comb filtering that sounds like interference, and an uneven frequency response that results in some frequencies being exaggerated or attenuated unnecessarily naturally. It goes without saying, but not every phase-related problem is going to manifest itself like that very first example I showed you with those two 808s that were perfectly out of phase. A lot of times they're going to be a lot more subtle, like what you see in this session. And you're going to have to just pay attention and see, does your bass sound in this case sound less clear, less articulate, less powerful, less impactful? And sometimes, again, it's not a huge difference, but it's enough of a difference that'll warrant you to take a deeper look. And the first way I do that is visually with my eyes looking in a session. I can just look at the waveforms and identify if they're moving in the same way. Are they moving up and down in the same direction? Or is there a difference in polarity between these sounds? Polarity refers to the orientation of the waveform, specifically whether it is in a positive or a negative alignment. So right now I've got 3 tracks in focus here, but of course you're going to want to look at all the low end sounds in your mix, maybe one-on-one at different times. But we can just focus on these 3 for now. Now what this is a bass sound and then 2 parallel tracks. So really this initial sound fed the next 2 tracks, but I've processed them differently, which is why they look different. One is a distortion, being the 808 fat. The other one is a parallel compression, which is 808 loud. Now again, you can kind of see that these are moving in the same way. You got the up pattern of the bass and then goes down. And at the same time on the distortion channel, it's happening in a similar way, but because it's a distortion, it is affecting the signal differently. And you can see that there is some differences here. Like right here, when my bass is going up, the distortion version is going down, as is the loud version, right? The compressed version. Similarly here on my distortion, it's going up, but it's down on my regular bass channel. And it's also up here on my loud channel, but then again, some slight differences here as this regular bass channel starts going up, the distortion goes up, and the 808 loud goes up, but then right after, both of these channels go down. So there are some differences once again in the polarity between them, and that requires us to solve this as a problem most likely, at least from a visual POV. Now, once we've uncovered this visually and we know that there seems to be some sort of issue, at least just with our eyes, we can now go in and actually play the track and pay attention to the sound itself. Just so we know what we're listening for, I'm going to solo each of these so you know, and then I'll put it into context, and we're just going to listen and see, does the bass sound weak or is it clear? Can I hear it clearly, and is the low end there more importantly? So here's just the bass channel on its own. Kind of a spiky electronic bass. Here's the 808 fat, which is really just a distortion channel for it. A little bit thinner sounding, but it really is intended to be more high-end focused. And let's look at the loud, which is the parallel compression channel. These are gain staged relatively quietly. The bass is intended to be the dominant one, whereas these two are supposed to sort of enhance it, right? Now, if I put all 3 of them together and we solo, now let me put them all in and let's listen in context now with everything. Now, to the average listener, you may not have caught that, but the reality is the bass is lacking in the low end, and that is the indication here that there is some sort of phase issue. Everything is gain staged, everything is loud, you can see the levels that are being set, and yet when I put everything together, we're not really hearing the bass, especially the low end of the bass, as clearly as we should be. You can hear the kick and the other elements, and you can even make out what the bass is playing in terms of the notes and the articulation, but we're definitely just not getting that low end presence. Of course, if everything was just gain staged too quietly, we could turn it up, but turning it up is not going to solve this problem. And we also know that because we visually looked at the waveforms and we could tell that there are things that are out of alignment that therefore need to be fixed. And just to further prove this point, let me play you my phase fixed version. You could tell the difference. So you can actually hear how much more pronounced the bass has become with my fixes, which I'm going to show you in a moment here. But overall, the first key step is just to visually look, identify if there is a phase issue just by looking at the alignment of the waveforms. If there is, play your track and listen closely and see if there is indeed a problem. Another good way to confirm if there's phase issues in your mix is to reference your mix in mono. You can do this simply by putting some sort of plugin that allows you to reference your track in mono directly on your final output or your master, which is what I have it on in this case. And I'm using the Brainworks BX meter, but really you can use anything. There's even a free tool out there called Manipulator, which is also worth checking out at no cost. But this plugin allows me to put this into mono really quickly by just simply pressing this M button. Now the key to this is when you sum the stereo signal of your total mix to mono, any phase cancellations or reinforcements between your left and right channels will become more noticeable, especially in the low end where phase issues are more pronounced. So that means when two signals that are out of phase are summed together, which is what's going to happen in this process, they'll interfere with each other and potentially cancel each other out. And that'll result in a weaker, thinner sounding signal, and it'll be a lot more obvious than listening in stereo, as you can imagine. However, on the opposite end, when two signals with similar phase are summed, they'll reinforce each other, and that'll result in a stronger, louder, or more present signal. Now, another key benefit of referencing in mono is that it'll help us hear phase issues that are being masked in the mix due to stereo imaging. And again, that's because referencing in mono will effectively collapse the stereo image into a single mono source. So that being said, I'm going to reference this whole mix in mono, and let's just really pay attention to the bass and see if we can notice any phase discrepancies. So the reality is in this session, the phase issues are a lot more subtle. When I actually put this into mono mode, the bass actually becomes a little bit more focused, which is a good sign. It's reinforcing itself, which is what I actually want to find out. I want to find out not only if the bass is out of phase and hearing if there's cancellation, but I also want to listen and hear if there's any reinforcement. The fact that there's some reinforcement here is actually a good sign. It means that the bass is more in phase than not, and I probably just have to do some very subtle maneuvers. However, when I'm listening in stereo mode, I'm definitely hearing some of that cancellation, and that could be a product of the stereo field itself. The fact that some of these bass tracks, as an example, these parallel tracks, my 808 fat, my 808 loud, these are stereo tracks, stereo parallels, whereas my bass itself is mono and in the middle. So while there is reinforcement, I'm definitely still aware that there is some sort of underlying issue that needs to be addressed in the phase. But the main thing to take away here is if you're struggling to hear phase issues in your mix, potentially throw on a plugin like this where you can reference your track in mono, and that might make it easier for you to identify if there is indeed phase issues happening in your track. Now, if you're really struggling to hear a difference, one thing you can do really simply and easily is put a plugin that has a phase inversion functionality on it. A lot of trim or utility plugins have this. I'm just going to use the FabFilter Pro Q3 here, and the phase inversion button looks like this. It looks like a O or a 0 with a line through it. You're just going to press that, and what that's going to do is it's going to reverse the polarity of one sound in your mix, the sound that you're applying this to. Polarity is essentially either 180 degrees in or out, and there's no adjustability on a smaller scale in this case. We're simply making it go one way or the other way, and that means, for example, in this case with our bass distortion, if our track is going up and then down again and then up. When I flip the polarity as I've done here, it's now going to be moving in the opposite way. It's actually going to be down during this first moment, and then these two parts that are down are actually going to be up, and then this up part is going to be down, and the down part is going to be up, and so on, right? So that's just going to basically completely invert the alignment of how this waveform is moving, but only this one because that's what it's applied to. So what we're doing here is I'm going to flip the phase, and I just want to listen and see, does the bass now hit more clearly before I do any of the other solutions that I'm going to show you later. And this is a good way to identify if you have a problem as well. If you flip the polarity, what's going to happen is you might notice that either your sound becomes way more pronounced, or it's going to do the opposite. It's going to create a phase problem, and ultimately it's going to sound more sucked out or thinner or hollow or just some of that negative stuff I talked about before. So let's play this. I'll just play this one little moment. Now, after you flip the phase on one track, listen closely and see if everything just sounds better, if it sounds more impactful. Is the low end there in this particular case? Because obviously we're focused on the low end sounds of our mix. If it does, chances are that that polarity reversal has either fixed your problem or indicates that you do need to go a little bit deeper and solve that problem with a different way. And of course, reversing the polarity is just one solution. It's not necessarily the best solution, but it is one solution of many. So hopefully you can tell, but the bass actually sounds thinner when I invert the polarity here. So obviously this is not what we want. want, but I'm using this as a way to identify if there is indeed a problem. Overall, it sounds better when I don't invert the polarity, but this could potentially be a very quick and easy solution. However, it's not necessarily the best. For that reason, I want to explore a couple of other solutions in this situation, and here's 3 of my go-to strategies that I typically rely on when it comes to fixing phase issues in my mix. Now, the first one is just to replace sounds altogether. The best way to avoid phase issues is to simply produce your song right and to pick the best quality sounds, and also limit how much competition there is in the low end in particular, because again, the more sounds you have in the low end, the more likely you are to experience phase issues and phase cancellation in your mix. My rule of thumb is everything should sound good and impactful before even going into the mixing stage. When I'm actually producing a track, I'm always being mindful to make sure that the kick and the bass, assuming I'm just using those 2 sounds, are impactful and not interfering with one another. That means they really should just hit from the jump with pretty much no processing, just setting levels and making sure that they're in the right place with one another. A lot of times, if you feel like you have to go and do a bunch of additional processing, chances are you're not actually working with the best quality sound to start, not necessarily the best sample or the best bass patch, and you want to actually switch it up and find a better one. And if your stuff is not hitting, if it's not impactful from jump, you don't even want to move into the mixing phase. You want to go back to the drawing board and choose the right samples. Now, sometimes choosing the right samples isn't feasible, especially if you're being handed something from another producer or another engineer. And for me, when I work with other producers and engineers, if I'm given a track and I'm mixing it and I find that the kick and bass relationship just isn't working, and if there's phase issues present, I'll actually go in and I'll ask for the MIDI files to the kick and the bass and ultimately replace those samples on my own with my own patches. I have access to a lot of different high quality plugins and sample libraries, and I know ultimately what's going to work, maybe in a more technical level than what some of these producers and engineers are currently doing. So if I can go in and make something better while still preserving their original vision, I will absolutely go ahead and do that. And that's also just a bonus lesson for all aspiring engineers. Don't just mix the song, but do everything you possibly can to make it better, including revisiting the production yourself if you need to, and if of course you have a blessing from the producer and artist. Now, assuming replacing samples and all that stuff is just out of the question, the next thing you can try is to shift the phase alignment between tracks to improve their coherence. Basically, we can use a phase alignment plugin to improve the coherence between 2 sounds and shift the phase in a smaller amount than the polarity flip we did previously. Now, adjusting the phase alignment is different from reversing the polarity, as it allows for finer control between the phase alignment of tracks. And that's what I have happening in this track here. I have a few different phase plugins all applied to the bass sounds to ultimately align them in timing a little bit better and make sure that their waveforms align better in the process. I'm going to show you how to do this in just a moment, but you can see that I have one on my regular bass, I have one on my distortion channel, and I also have one on my parallel channel, and each of them is doing a slightly different delay move to ultimately bring them more in line with each other and make them more coherent. Now, to get this started, the first thing you want to do is sort of figure out which track should be the master one, or the one that's going to dictate how these tracks get aligned. So in my case, I'm going to use my regular bass track here, which I've put an 808 sidechain on. I know it's not an 808, but I've just always have this as a stock thing in my session, and I know that it basically is the bass sidechain. So I have this bass sidechain or 808 sidechain already set up here, and we're going to use this to feed the in-phase plugin on the other channel. So as an example, if I go to my 808 fat here, I'm going to choose my key input to be that same send that I just set up. Now, when you set this up, you're probably going to have it look more like this, okay? So we're going to have the default setting here just to start from scratch. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually change my alpha process from channel 1 to channel 1 and 2, and then my beta process, as a result of doing that, you see it's channel 2 right now, and I click it again, it goes to sidechain. So what this is going to do is it's going to analyze the regular signal that I'm applying it to, being the distortion channel, that'll appear up top, and in the bottom it'll be the sidechain, which is going to be my 808 sidechain here, being my regular bass channel. So now that I have these two set up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to press the capture button, and I'm going to just play a moment of the track, right? I'm going to play this loop that I have, and you're going to see this populate with both waveforms. Now, what we could do is we could zoom in and scroll around using this, and we can really zero in and see, how are these waveforms aligned? Just like you could if you were looking at the audio as I was before. Now, one thing that I like to do is actually pay attention to the correlation meter here. This correlation meter indicates how coherent these two sounds are, how in phase are they. The closer you are to -1 being the farthest point here, this is going to be the most out of phase. The closer you are to the right side, which is +1, the more in phase you are. Now, the reality is, unless your sounds are exact duplicates, they're never going to be perfectly in phase. However, our goal is to be as close to +1 as possible, and that's what we're going to do with this plugin. So what you could do now is you could use the delay function here to ultimately shift the waveform, your channel 1 and 2 waveform being the distortion in this case, and it's ultimately going to improve or reduce the coherence and make it worse. So I'm going to just simply use the delay to try to increase this number from 0.42 to something higher. It might just be 0.43, it might be 0.8, it really depends on the sound, but let's try. So with this slight nudge, I was able to actually increase it from 0.42 to 0.47. So now it's more coherent technically. And unfortunately, once I started going beyond this point, you saw that it actually started to work against and go in the opposite direction, right? So obviously you have to sort of pick your battles and try to get it as coherent as possible, but there is a limit to how coherent it will be. So if we just want to focus on these two tracks, let's see the difference. I'm going to bypass this in-phase plugin, play the track and put it in, and let's see if it sounds better with this in-phase plugin or not. Night and day different, way better. You can just hear the bass is so much clearer as a result of doing this. Now, if you don't have access to a fancy plugin like I'm using here, you're gonna have to do a slightly different approach, and that would be manually adjusting the timing of the tracks to ensure that their waveforms align properly. So to exemplify this, let's take a look at the bass and the kick within this track in particular. And you can tell visually, first things first, that there are definitely moments where they're moving in an opposite polarity with one another. The kick sometimes moving upwards or having a positive polarity, while the bass has a downward polarity. Same thing happens at a number of different intervals here throughout this track. Now, there are moments where the kick is going to be playing on its own, and that's not really going to be a big deal because there's no competition between these two sounds. However, when they are playing simultaneously, there's definitely going to be some phase cancellation taking place. So just to exemplify this, let me play this, and I got both of these tracks solo. Check it out. Now, it's not the worst it can be, but when these two sounds are hitting at the same time, you can tell that there's just a lack of clarity at times between them, and there's not as much impact as there could be. Maybe a little bit of congestion is another way to say it. So what we can do here is manually align the phase using our judgment here. And what I like to do is first just find a moment where both of these sounds are hitting at the same time, which is right here. I'm going to make a little incision at the start of the kick. And what I'm going to do is just move this around, but delicately at the same time. And I'm going to move it forward in the arrangement here. So that way the phase can be better aligned, ideally. Now, of course, we're just going to use our judgment. This is not really foolproof. And if you go too crazy with this, you could really affect the timing of your track. So we're talking about making very small nudges either earlier or later on one of the tracks to ultimately make them more pronounced and hopefully mitigate some of these phase issues. So with that being said, let me see if I could just bring this up a little bit. And I think my goal will be to actually have the upward cycle align with the upward cycle here. Now, again, it's not perfect. You can see that there are definitely some moments where there's still some reverse polarity happening. However, there are moments where they're more in phase with one another, as you can tell, especially later on in the cycle. So even though I've cut the beginning here, I'm going to actually stretch it out. And assuming this works, I'm going to want to actually stretch out the entire waveform so that timing applies to everything. But let's take a listen. And in post, I will do some sort of editing magic so you can compare the before, the move, and after. Here we go. So hopefully you could tell that it sounds better. And of course, now that I know that I like this, I'm going to stretch this out. Now, of course, there is a fourth solution, which is reversing the polarity 180 degrees with a phase inversion plugin. And this is why I showed it to you first. You can easily use that as a way to correct phase problems in your mix, but that's usually if it appears to be less time-based and more just about how the waveforms move in general. However, flipping the polarity this way is pretty limited in scope and much less precise than the other methods I showed you, especially that second one of using a phase alignment plugin like InPhase from Waves. However, in a quick pinch, it could definitely bail you out depending on your situation. Now, a question you might be wondering is, when exactly should I be tackling phase issues in my mixes? I'd say as early as possible, if not being the first thing you do in your mix. Now, my process, honestly, is to first set my level so I can hear the issues first, and then correct phase issues from there, assuming they exist, before moving on to my next processes. So that means before you go ahead and add EQ and compression and saturation and other processing, you address the phase phase issues in your mix first and foremost before going ahead. Otherwise, all of that extra processing may only exaggerate the phase issues that exist at the foundational level of your mix and become even more problematic later. Now, I'm currently working on a follow-up to this video which will explore EQ secrets to achieve a more impactful low end. So if you're struggling with mixing tracks, especially bass, kick, and low end elements, make sure you subscribe to the channel to see that video when it goes live. In the meantime, click the card you see on screen right now to watch a video I did about a better way to use sidechain compression to achieve more separation between competing sounds like the kick and the bass. Don't forget to like the video if you haven't already, and I'll catch you next time. Peace.
5